Hello and welcome to the Midnight Choir. I spend a lot of time complaining about how I believe that the journalism coming from major news outlets is somewhat ineffectual. They are the only groups with resources, and yet they don't use these resources for deep, grounded journalism. Sitting there, always thinking about things like that, I felt the only way that it's justifiable for me to levy complaints like that at larger companies is if I sit down with someone who believes in these institutions and allow them to defend their position. I called up another journalist, Steve Faguy, who works for the Montreal Gazette. His work is great, and over the years he's become a proper expert on the ins and outs of mainstream media. He agreed to have a very frank conversation with me and told me that he would be pushing back against much of what I levied at him in the interview questions. I looked forward to it, and the two of us sat down and had a great conversation for about an hour. I didn't walk away agreeing with him, but his opinions were extremely well expressed, and clearly he had profound knowledge and experience. For anyone who is in a similar boat to me, I encourage you to listen to this and allow him to express his opinions. Form your own thoughts. Thank you so much for listening to the Midnight Choir. We are part of the Rover Media Network, coming out of Montreal, Quebec, one of the few Anglophone journals doing extremely deep, investigative journalism. So if you want to check out more of our work, go to therover.ca/newsletter or therover.ca/support-us and sign up for our newsletter, paid or otherwise. We would love your support. If you don't have cash, please hit that subscribe or like button or sign up to this podcast on your respective podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast. So please enjoy the work that we're doing, and for now, enjoy this interview. I wanted to start off discussing what is going on with the finances of mainstream media right now and independent media. So the first question I have for you is, why are larger media companies struggling to survive financially?
There are various reasons. I think the biggest thing is advertising. Advertising revenue has kind of fallen off a cliff, whether it's print or radio or television or even digital. People have found new ways to advertise, and those ways generally mean either Facebook or Google, who have sopped up about 80% of the advertising market in just a matter of years. From an advertiser's perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Instead of buying an ad in a newspaper that might be read by 10,000, 20,000 people, you can buy an ad on Facebook that will be read by just the people you decide you want to target. That ability to, have your ad find the people that you want to target, that are more likely to, be swayed, be interested in your services, is very valuable. You get a lot of small businesses who don't want to advertise to the masses; they want to get a specific audience, and digital advertising allows you to reach that audience. And so we're seeing fewer people spending a lot more money to advertise in more mainstream newspapers and radio and television stations, when they can advertise much more cheaply and much more targeted through digital means. And unfortunately, those digital means are mainly controlled by two companies that have gobbled up the market.
Was that always the case? What was it like in the mid 2000s before giant tech monopolies sort of took over? Was there more advertising revenue going around, or was there less? What was going on back then?
It's hard to say. It was more of a transition period. Like, you still had a lot of advertising going the way it did in the 90s and 80s and 70s through the major the major media outlets. You had some online advertising agencies, advertising services, that in some cases either got bought up by bigger and bigger companies, or that shut down when Facebook and Google came on the scene.
Right.
So that market didn't really have a chance to mature before we saw this this concentration of power in these particularly these two companies.
Is that the same reason we've seen the death of smaller and medium media companies? I think it was last year, Metro Media went out of business, and you see places, I'm originally from BC, you see all the smaller newspapers from the local towns going out of business, some of the provincial newspapers going out of business. Is that the reason for that? You just have no
I think
advertising
it's
income?
it's a very similar problem.
Mm.
Small community newspapers and community media rely even more on advertising
Okay.
because they're not going to have generally a product that people are going to pay $20-$30 a month to subscribe to. And so when that advertising goes out the window, when those advertisers decide, hey, I can spend $30 on Facebook to get as much ads as it takes for $3,000 in the newspaper,
Mm.
um, then uh, yeah, you're seeing those outlets suffering as well. It's not just something that's affecting the big guys; it's affecting the little guys as well.
Right. Steve, did you see the article that came out yesterday? How CBC gave $18 million in bonuses to the managements?
Yeah, so sort of a separate thing, but like CBC has for its executives, for its non-union executives, it has contracts that include performance pay. So similar to um, uh, uh, a large for-profit corporation that will say if you meet these targets, some of your compensation will be based on performance. In
Okay.
CBC, it's something similar, although it's not obviously related to how much profit they make because it's a nonprofit organization, and that is interpreted as sort of bonuses because it's by definition, I guess it's a bonus on top of your base salary, but it is part of their employment agreements, as I understand it.
Okay.
So it's being spun, particularly by those who don't like the CVC very much, as this like discretionary free for all where they're just you know giving out money because it's not their money, it's taxpayer money, and they're happy to spend it. But it's
Yeah.
it's merely that they've reached certain performance metrics that they have set internally, and
Right.
that those people are entitled to that compensation.
With that kind of thing, how do you feel about that? Because I'm certainly I love the CBC. I think it's a very important institution for Canada, for democracy in Canada, especially. But I still wonder about the morality of that when so many smaller media companies are struggling to stay afloat. And I also consider those to be important to democracy. So
Mhm.
I wonder about the efficacy of that when that same money could be used to potentially give grants and funding to smaller media companies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to find too much pushback from anyone who argues that the CBC is um, it's a very big organization.
It's
It
huge.
has a lot of managers. It has a lot of higher ups. It's trying to do everything to please everyone, um, and that maybe there should be um, some sort of review, some sort of tightening of its mandate. The problem is that nobody can agree on what exactly that's going to be,
Right.
because do you have less in terms of Canadian programming and Canadian dramas and comedies, Canadian scripted programming? Do you have less news? Do you get rid of CBC News? Do you do so in large markets? Do you do so in small markets? Do you get rid of CBC Radio, which a lot of communities rely on? Do you get rid of their digital stuff? Do you get rid of their children's programming? CBC does a lot, and
They do a huge
each of
amount.
those things has a an audience, a group, an interest group, an industry that it will fight very hard to defend it. So it's very hard um, to push the CBC to sort of cut off some of its limbs if you want to get it smaller.
Right. Are you allowed to talk a little bit about the struggles with Post Media recently? I will not ask you if you are not allowed to. Because with all
So
the sales and
I'm
stuff like
not,
that.
obviously, I work for Post Media. I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
Post Media spokesperson. So for anything you want to ask the company, definitely would refer you to communications. I can talk about the media sort of in a general sense.
Yeah.
I am certainly not privy to any internal
Internal.
Post Media
Yeah.
strategies. So anything
Mm.
that I do say that could be interpreted as that should be taken as an uninformed speculation on my part. Just to be very clear, I don't want people to start, trading securities based on what I'm saying here.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. You don't. You are not. Before I ask any questions, you are not an official spokesperson. If anyone is like, "Hey, well, Steve Faguy on the Midnight Choir said this, and therefore, no,
Yeah.
no.
I'm
Steve
just a
Faguy is
I'm just
he's a journalist.
I'm just a guy working the front lines here.
One sec, I'm going to pull up an information. So, in the past year, I think it was 6 months ago, Post Media laid off 11% of its staff. Am I correct? And
I'm not sure about the statistics, but that doesn't
that's what the
sound
Globe and Mail says.
right.
So 11% of its staff. And how big of a deal is that to the production line there? There's less and less journalists working for places like Post Media, or maybe there isn't. Maybe they're just doing it to hire less expensive labor, but it seems to be around the same time that Post Media was bought out by an American company. Am I correct?
So again, this is sort of post media stuff. I will say that at least from post media's perspective, saying that they're owned by an American company is something they push back against.
Okay,
There is a U.S. based hedge fund that has equity in Post Media. The way Post Media
understood.
is structured is that there's money that is sort of backing the the equity of the company, but the control of the company is still within the hands of Canadians, and that's deliberately done because to be eligible for certain tax breaks, the company has to be at least legally Canadian owned. So, again, I will defer to official Post Media spokespeople for any details on that.
Okay,
But I will say, in the larger sense, yeah, we've seen layoffs from Chorus, from Bell, from Rogers. Layoffs, I should say, layoffs or reductions. Some cases, they're buyouts or retirements that have not been filled or whatever.
right.
But yeah, these major media companies in Canada are getting smaller, um, and that's because they're seeing their revenues fall off. Whether it's from people no longer buying newspaper ads, just this complete disappearance of classified ads, um, or on the television side, people are no longer subscribing to television. They've dropped their cable packages. They're no longer watching TV the way they used to because there are all these other streaming platforms and other ways to other places to divert your attention, whether it's YouTube or TikTok or whatever. Um, so so yeah, everyone's getting smaller. Everyone's trying to trim what they can without affecting quality or without um, you know uh, uh, touching their core mandate. But it is very difficult because a lot of these people have already cut in the past and are, they say they're cutting to the bone and then cutting the bone and cutting off limbs.
Right.
It is a fairly dire situation out there for
It
companies big and
seems to
small.
be. Journalism seems to be in a dire scenario right now. That's now, Steve. I don't work for a larger media company. How does the need to have so much financial revenue and be profitable affect the journalism that you are doing?
Um, that's an interesting question. Again, speaking more generally, I would say that it affects different organizations in different ways. If you're part of a smaller organization where kind of like Chris Curtis, where you're the publisher, you're the de facto editor in chief, you're responsible for both sides. It can have a big impact when we have one side of your brain thinking about revenues and the other side thinking about trying to meet your objectives. For large organizations, you can have more of a split. You can have people who are just focused on the editorial side. For example, in my case, I'm not selling advertising. I'm not um, looking specifically at the revenue side. But at the same time, it is part of our job now to sort of, they call it engagement to find ways to attract audiences. So I think you're seeing frontline workers like me, for example, have paying more attention to what is doing well, um, what is getting engagement, what is getting views, and not just in the clickbaity sense, but like what is driving subscriptions? What are people talking about? Um, it used to be 20 years ago that wasn't really our concern. We were like, just put out the best product possible. We're not getting daily feedback, daily statistics on audience, so it didn't affect the daily lives. So now we're, I think, uh, in various media organizations, the editorial staff is more aware of what works, what doesn't, what is engaging audiences, and what audiences want more of.
Can I zero in on something you said there? You said back in the day, essentially, I'm paraphrasing. Back in the day, we put out the best product possible. Does that imply that you no longer are doing that?
um no, I would say that it is that you're still doing that, but what the best product possible is, um that definition has sort of changed, because you're also taking into account the fact that, like, it doesn't matter how good a story is if nobody's reading it, it doesn't make a difference. So you're also trying to incorporate into that a bit of feedback on what people are interested in, what people want, what people find useful. One thing that we've done more of these days, and I actually want us to do more of as an industry in general, is, they have various names for it, solutions based journalism. Just like, people come to us for uh, because they want to learn something, because they want information that is going to be useful for them. So, for example, we had torrential rain last week. That you know we did the usual basic story on it. This many people lost power, and these roads were flooded and whatever. Meanwhile, there are thousands of people with flooded basements
Right.
who, maybe this is the first disaster they've had to deal with. It's the first time they had to call an insurance company, and they're like, "What do I do now?" Um, and so we're seeing more of, here's what you do when you're in that kind of situation. More information um, that is directly useful for people. And I think that's more a result of feedback that we get, where, okay, when we post this, it does very well because people are looking for this kind of information. So, it's no secret that with fewer human resources, you can't do as much. You can't be as comprehensive as it used to be. Um, but the flip side is that with more feedback, um, with more direct communication with people, you can get a better idea of what they're interested in and cater to those interests.
I There seems to be less and less funding from major media companies, and let's be honest, the moment the conservatives are in power, if the conservatives get in power, they will defund the CBC. They do it every time. They're already talking about it. Pierre Poilievre said something to the effect of, I cannot wait to defund the CBC recently. I think that was about a week
Yeah,
ago.
it's a little unclear what he means by that.
It is
So
very
for,
unclear.
for example, like, people, you say defund, people are like, okay, you're going to cut off their funding.
Yeah.
Um, but when you press particularly conservatives about that over the years, they have generally said, "Oh, well, we're not going to touch Radio Canada. We're not going to touch the French services because those are popular, and
You're
we want
cutting off
those
a
to be
limb
back."
if you touch the French service.
So now we're
Yeah.
talking about, oh, well, then, okay, so we're talking about cutting half the CBC, and then some people in smaller communities are like, "Oh, but what about CBC Radio?" And then
Okay.
we had a conservative MP recently saying, that, they would protect CBC radio services, at least in small communities, and then having to walk that back because it went a little bit against the
Conservative
official
policy.
party Poilievre
Right.
line. So we're not entirely sure what it means. There's a lot of rhetoric here. I feel like when they get into
Okay.
power, it might not be as dramatic as some of their base
Yeah.
hopes.
Right.
But sure, there's definitely going to be cuts to funding uh, uh, of the CBC. They've made it clear that that's what they want to do. And certainly, these journalism subsidy programs that the Liberal government has put into place, those would likely be in jeopardy. Legislation, so, Bill C11, Bill C18, we could see those being reversed. And
Might be
you
for the
know,
best
I think it's
for sharing
$100 million that
journalism.
Google is spending on Canadian media, that that could disappear.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because Google, for those who don't know, yes, Meta has blocked the sharing of journalists and articles and stuff like that. But Google is paying out a pretty significant amount to media companies in Canada. So, for example, I believe the rover will be receiving 35,000, something like that. I can't speak to the exact numbers. That's Chris's job. I'm working for Chris, but the rover will have a pretty significant amount of money coming in from Google every year from this legislation, right? So, I would like Meta to start sharing it, and I think the government needs to swing their big dicks around a little bit more and force them to either get out of the country. If you want to operate here, share the articles and pay your share, or get out of the country. But we'll see what happens with that. But the thing I was going to talk about, Steve, is so the bigger companies are losing revenue somewhat, and it's hard to stay afloat because they need to make a profit and they have shareholders and they're beholden to that. Meanwhile, you have a lot of independent journalism happening now. And I can see both having advantages and both having disadvantages. So the larger companies have usually, not all of them, let's be real, HuffPost is problematic, Fox News is problematic, Breitbart, whatever. They usually have a pretty strict ethical guideline, right? If you work for the New York Times, you have to, if you go read their ethics, you have to follow that as a journalist. If you go look at routers, you have to follow those ethics. AP, same deal. Post Media, they have an ethics. CBC has an ethics. You can go look at their ethics in journalism, okay? And the journalists have to follow that rule book, okay? Meanwhile, independent media, toss up as to whether they have some ethical rule book that they follow. Although the Journalist Guild of Quebec, for example, they do have an ethical guideline that you need to say that you will follow if you want to be part of the guild. Now, with the slow loss of revenue and the diminishing sizes of larger media corporations, Steve, do you think that independent media is the future, or do you think there is a future for the larger companies?
I don't think it's an either or thing. I think
Okay.
if we're going to rescue the journalism industry, it needs to be diverse. It needs to have those large, mainstream, big budget, uh, big audience organizations, but also needs community media. It needs independent media. It needs, dare I say it, even partisan media. It needs to have all sorts of different options for people who want different things from different people. So I don't think a future in which every media is independent is necessarily good, nor do I think a future where every media is part of one giant conglomerate is very good. I think if we fix the fundamentals of how journalism works, of how media works, then you will sort of see organically a more diverse ecosystem out there that will include all of those elements.
What are the fundamental problems that you're talking about there?
Um, I mean, put simply, people are not willing to pay for news. Um, a lot of people are perfectly happy with the stuff they get on Facebook or Twitter or other social media.
It's terrible
They
news. I just want
don't.
to throw that out there. It's really unreliable stuff.
Yeah, or you're like, oh well, I get all my news from like this account, and that account is just repeating what they read from CBC or Global News or
Yeah.
Post Media or whatever. Um, we don't have a lot of literacy in terms of where news comes from or how news works, and so people are like, well, I don't need to pay for it. Why should I? Um, and the I don't want to blame everything on the oligopoly when it comes to online advertising, but that is a serious issue. We have this everything is controlled through Google and Facebook. If you look at any media organizations traffic statistics, at least before the Facebook ban came into effect, something like 2/3 of their traffic came from either Google or Facebook.
Right.
And so, when they're relying on these organizations so much, that is problematic. Um, but it is difficult to diagnose the problem and suggest solutions because I don't know if there are any. We've been trying to fix this problem for 10, 15, 20 years, and various experiments have come out there. A lot of them have failed. um, Things that seem like very good ideas.
Right.
Some people are successful, others have tried to replicate that success and failed. So it is not there. I don't think there is a magical solution to this problem, unfortunately. And so, it's going to be a while before we come to some sort of equilibrium where, we can say that this industry is healthy again.
Mm. Yeah, the journalism industry is very unhealthy. And I don't, it is partly because of the funding, but I'd like to use this opportunity to pivot into the other thing I wanted to talk about with you, which is the public's distrust in media that is just exponentially growing. Um, I'd say it probably started in 2016 with the rise of Trumpism, maybe a little before that. I'd love to hear your take on that. What has contributed to the erosion of trust in media companies, in journalism? What has contributed to that?
So yeah, I would say it started well before that.
Okay.
We saw it
Okay.
during the
I
George
was
W. Bush
very young back then.
administration in the U.S. This sort of this line of attack against the media,
Okay.
saying that, oh, they're biased against us. You need to listen to this media and not this media. I think it's a symptom of an overall problem of polarization, where you have a set mind view, you have your clique, you have your um, the side of a political argument that is going on. You stick to that side. You listen to everyone who agrees with you, and you reject everyone who disagrees with you. And when the media come out there, and whether it's media that is biased for the other side, or media that is relatively neutral and trying to present a more nuanced picture, if their conclusion doesn't agree with your worldview, then you reject it. And so a lot of people who have more extreme worldviews have decided to reject the media in general because those, what they say conflicts with that. And it's kind of human nature that we put everything through this partisan lens, these rose-colored glasses, or whatever the opposite of rose-colored glasses is, um, and we either accept it or reject it, not based on the strength of the arguments, but based on whether we agree with the conclusion.
Right. The people are listening to respond, not listening to, you know, have a discussion.
Yeah,
That
people
classic.
don't want nuance. People don't want, well, this but this. They're
Right.
like, oh, this is against my values, therefore it's wrong.
The media has, I'm going to pivot to access journalism. Basically, in order to have access to politicians, to people in power, which makes for interesting journalism, they will lowball questions, or they won't ask hard hitting questions. Do you think that has affected people's trust?
Um, I don't know that there's a direct impact. Like, I think we're getting into stuff that's a bit more inside baseball that, like, most people don't really pay attention to. Um, there are journalists who get access, who aren't necessarily doing softballs or whatever. You think of someone like Bob Woodward in the U.S., who will get access to all sorts of people who want to talk to him, mainly because of the reputation he has built, and get stuff that is pretty damning against people in power. I think with politics, it's like each industry is different. With politics, it's kind of special because um, you have people on the same side, but a lot of people love to talk. A lot of people love to make themselves seem important and be like, "Hey, I got a real scoop for you." Um, and others like to manipulate the media. It's a sort of a, a mutually beneficial relationship sometimes, where you get a scoop in exchange for XYZ. And this kind of horse trading has gone on for decades. Like, people like to romanticize about the
Old
ethics
school
of journalism
journalists.
in, like, the 1950s or whatever. But I have heard so many stories of people like being like, "Oh yeah, I didn't publish that because I wanted to, I wanted to stay friends with that person," or "Oh yeah, we went out drinking after this with our sources and whatever." Um, I think if anything, we've gotten a bit when it comes to mainstream publications. We're even stricter on ethics rules now than we used to be. Um, Partly because social media makes people a lot more accountable. It used to be if it wasn't in a newspaper, people didn't know about it. Now, you know, because of Twitter, because of other media outlets out there, if you do something that is questionable, that could eventually come out.
Hmm.
So yeah, and in politics, it's different from sports. It's different from other stuff. Access journalism, um, it can be useful. It doesn't necessarily um, have to be one sided or softball journalism. Because if you're lobbing softballs, what's the point of getting access to just get even more self-serving information? Um, but I would say that some people do, through getting access, um, do some very very good quality journalism, and some people who don't have any access at all, who get their information through access to information requests, or who are considered openly hostile to the people they're trying to get access to, can also do some very good journalism as well. Again, it's a question of diversity and having that diverse ecosystem where people use, to borrow an expression from the left, a diversity of tactics to get to the truth. And I think that's all part of that all needs to be part of the ecosystem.
I have a friend, Rachel, who worked for Global, and she had this incredible story on Palestine, and she had witnesses and multiple witnesses to the person's testimony, and Global refused to publish her article because it mentioned Palestine. So, my question to you is this: are large media corporations censoring information to cater to a broader public?
That's a complicated question to answer,
Mm-hmm.
because like I don't know this particular case. I don't know what the reasoning was. If I were to take a guess, my guess would be that it wasn't necessarily that they're trying to cater to their pro-Israeli audience. It's that, okay, this is Palestine. This is a landmine here that we're going to step on. Is it worth it for us? Because there are organizations out there who, on both sides, who will come after you if you publish something that could even be interpreted as being negative toward their side and unfair. Um, so, is there censorship? I would say probably not in what we think of as censorship, but are there are some media organizations afraid to touch certain issues because of how hot button they are, because they don't have um, the expertise, the experience, the skills to manage that. Maybe. Um, I think that yeah. So I think that because of whether it's um, a mix of self censorship and people being afraid to talk about um, certain hot button issues, there may be a bit of the same kind of effect there without there being an overt, we will not talk about this issue, from some media organizations. um, we A lot of media these days are focused on local news, are focused on community news or specialized news related to whatever. They don't have journalists in Palestine or Israel or the Middle East or anywhere outside the country. And so they might not have the resources to give a full backstory to any story they might publish about this conflict. And people are very eager to complain when a story about whatever does not include all of this context that they want to see added, to make their side seem more palatable.
But wouldn't you say it's our job as journalists to step on that landmine that you mentioned? Like, is it not our job to report the truth and what is happening, regardless of who it might piss off?
Sure. I think the thing is that um, some newsrooms, because of how much they've shrunk, because of how much they've had to focus on their core, um, their core mandate, don't have the resources to treat stories like this properly. Global News does not have a Middle East correspondent who can provide sufficient context for what's going on there. So they will rely on other agencies, whether it's the Associated Press or Reuters or whoever, who do have expertise in that area and who can report those kinds of stories. Um, some organizations, Globe and Mail, CBC, maybe, um, do have that power and do have that international reporting experience. But I find a lot of times when, a local news organization, a reporter comes out of the blue with a story that is about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, sometimes you have to ask, like, why why is this story written? What is the story about? What is the motivation behind having this story? And and you have to vet these stories. You have to go over them with a fine tooth comb. You might even have to get them lawyered. And a lot of organizations, like, we don't have the resources to do that. We don't have the time to do that. We don't have the will to do that, um, for a story that maybe isn't going to make much of a difference. That people are going to reject because they disagrees with their worldviews, um, or isn't going to make much of a splash because it's not their core mandate, the kinds of stories that people come to them for. Um, so I'm not arguing necessarily. I'm not arguing that we should be censoring the truth, but I would say that certain stories have certain places, and if you have a media organization that tries to branch out into something they don't have experience in, even if it's for a good cause, they might end up doing more harm than good because you know if you have a story that say you're pro-Palestinian and you have a story that seems very pro-Palestine, if that story has a bunch of factual holes, then you have the lobbyists on the other side who are going to put it up as a poster child of why everything on the pro-Palestinian side is wrong. It might serve more to discredit your movement if you don't have that story rock solid. So, it's not just a question of, oh, the big media is out um, to silence our side of the story. A lot of the time, it's just they don't have the resources because of how much time and money pressure they're under, or they don't have the expertise to give this a proper vetting.
Yeah, I only, just to be clear to the audience, I only use Palestine as an example because it's such a hot button issue, and it's a lot of companies won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, and so like I wasn't trying to like make a point on that front. Just to be clear, I was just using it as like it's a very good
It's a good
example.
example of something that um, of something that a lot of media companies won't touch, not because they have a side in this issue, whether it's pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, but they know from experience that when if they want to go in that direction, they have to spend a lot of time and often money to make sure they get it right. And a lot of times that's just not worth it to them for the kinds of
Right.
stories that they would be producing.
Do you think that this unwillingness to devote resources to big topics like this is one of the reasons for declining trust in the media?
Um, I don't know. I think yeah, I think it's kind of putting the cart before the horse, maybe a little bit, in the sense that the decline of revenue, the financial decline, has led to not being able to cover stories that people want to see covered. Um, And I think distrust in the media, people who distrust the media aren't like, oh, well, I trust CBC and Global because they have foreign correspondents, but I don't trust, my local news agency because they're not doing stories in Palestine. It's generally a global thing. It's generally a widespread thing when you don't trust the media, don't trust mainstream media in general.
Mm.
So I don't think it's a question of resources that you're putting in. I think it's a question of, you're already polarized, so you're not looking at news with an open mind.
Mm. Yeah. Um, how do you see the declining trust in our media institutions affecting democracy and or civic engagement?
So I think people who generally just distrust the media, and I'm talking media as a whole, not just like
Hmm.
one
Hmm.
outlet,
Yeah.
it's part of it's part of an ecosystem where they're not just distrusting the media, they're also distrusting the government, and I mean the government at large, government agencies, not just the politicians. They're distrusting of academia because those things reinforce each other. When the media says, "Oh well, we're reporting this because this is what this government agency says about X," and the academics say, "Well, yeah, you're right. I've studied this. I believe X, Y, Z." Then people have to reject all three of those. They have to say, "Oh well, the media is in bed with the academics, which is in bed with the deep state or whatever."
The deep
Um,
state. Yeah.
and uh, and so yeah, like if people only distrusted the media and they did trust academics and government, then I don't think we would be in as much of a problem now, because you'd have a source for a trusted source for quote unquote the truth. But because people reject anything that goes against their worldview, you're seeing them have distrust in all of these organizations at the same time. And
Mm.
that's a bit why I think like it's not necessarily fair to blame the media for distrust in the media, because it is all part of this system that also affects um, you know uh, academic expertise and government expertise and other types of authority. People are just not willing to accept authority in general
We live in a very
when they disagree with it.
anti-authority kind of like epoch in society.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter how strong a news story is, if people distrust everything, they're just going to distrust everything. And I would say that I think this idea of distrust in the media, it is a thing. It is a quantifiable thing, but I also think it might be a bit of an exaggerated thing, because just like people get increasingly polarized through social media, I think a lot of people get an idea of what the world is like through that same lens, through social media. We think the
Right.
world is a lot more polarized than it is because we focus so much on social media. If you just talk to regular people, generally they're not as chronically online as the people who are active on Twitter or Facebook. And generally they'll have a lot more down to earth opinions. They'll be like, yeah, I trust my local newspaper. It'll be a lot more nuanced than, everyone online who's like, I, only trust media sources that, agree with me.
Right. Do you think the journalists being ever present online, tweeting their reports, tweeting their thoughts, as like the other day, you see a presentation or a speech by Donald Trump from Mar-a-Lago, and you just have journalists tweeting their thoughts the whole time. Do you think that's a good or bad thing for the trust of journalists?
Um, Both, I will
Okay.
say.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah,
So
yeah.
one thing about trust, like I'm someone who is online. I'm active on Twitter. I engage with people who engage with me, and one thing that I think is important is a bit of transparency of like, this is what I think, this is what I feel, and I am open to discussion, to changing my mind on things, to new information. And even if you are, far on the left or far on the right, if you are open minded, you are transparent, you will gain trust because people will be like, okay, I um, I know where this person is coming from. This person is not hiding anything from me. This person does not want to hide anything from me. I think a lot of it is, when you see journalists who are willing to engage, willing to discuss about the journalism they do, that can build trust. Whereas if you see journalists who are like, I hate Donald Trump, he's a stupid idiot, are you going to trust what that person writes about the US election campaign? Probably not, because you already know that person has come to a conclusion about one of the candidates. Um, so I think it's a question of trust. It's not that if you're more online, you're more or less trustworthy. It's about what you are doing when you engage. If you shut down any criticism, and let me tell you, it is a very um, instinctual thing to do. It
It's
is
hard to
very
take
easy to fall
criticism,
into
man.
that thing of
It's hard.
anyone who criticizes me is wrong. I got a counterpoint. But if you engage with people honestly and open mindedly and wanting to listen to what they say and incorporate that, then that's the kind of thing that builds trust over time.
Let's be clear. We're talking about engaging and being open to people who are good faith in their criticism. Like, we're not talking about people who are like, well, you suck,
Sure, I
like
think a lot of
trolls.
people assume bad faith where it doesn't necessarily exist.
Yes, that's
Um,
true. Yeah,
and
yeah.
so you have to be very clear, and it's not necessarily like you can engage with bad faith people because your audience might not just be that person.
Hmm.
So if someone makes a bad faith argument, you'd be like, okay, here are the facts. I'm not going to throw out ad hominems. I'm
Right.
not going to call you stupid, but for the benefit of my audience and whoever else might be, listening to this conversation, here are the facts. You can draw your own conclusions.
Right. Yeah. Good take. I think a really good take on social media, because it's a challenging line to walk, especially considering how addictive it is. And I see a lot of journalists get really bogged down in the weeds, debating the most useless things. Somebody will say something, they'll just like, yeah, well, you suck. Like, it's like one-liners becoming somebody's journalism, and you're like, a one-liner is not a journalistic take. That's not a well-researched take. That one-liner comeback is funny, maybe, maybe it builds engagement, but I don't know if that builds your rapport with the audience.
I mean, it gives people an idea of who you are, and in
Yeah.
some cases, that might be a thin-skinned, person who's very vain. And I think people will be surprised how many journalists are like that.
Yeah.
Not, and I don't make myself an exception to that.
Yeah. I mean, we're all
It gets
thin-skinned
me
on
when
certain
people
things.
throw insults my way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but that all of the stuff that you do reflects on you, and people need to understand that. And you can do stuff that reflects on you well, and you can do stuff that reflects on you badly.
Why do you think this is sort of off the journalism topic, but more about academia, which I think journalism is a type of academia? Uh, where do you think the distrust of academia and writers and thinkers comes from? Is that exclusive to the rural setting, or is that a little bit everywhere right now?
I mean,
The
it's definitely
Sorry.
everywhere. It's not like one specific
Mm.
type of person. Um, Part of it is the same thing that affects the media and government, right? It's this polarization. This, people are stuck in their bubbles, and they're not willing to engage with um, things that might go against their worldviews. Added to that, there's a bit of lack of education. People don't know how things work, and so when something they don't understand comes up, they're willing to accept a conspiracy theory that makes no logical sense if you know what's going on, but from a layman's perspective, maybe um, maybe might make sense. And I don't want to blame the education system. I think education is a lifelong thing, and I think it is the job of academics and the government and the media to educate people, not to, you know, tell people that, if we use climate change as an example, tell people, oh, climate is an emergency. We have to use the term emergency and crisis as opposed to global warming, because we need to, get to people's emotions to make them understand what's going on. No, you need to explain, how carbon dioxide traps heat, and how, the emissions have gone up, and where things are working and where things are not. The more nuance you can bring, the more facts you can bring, so people can come to their own conclusions about stuff, so people can learn. The more trust you can build, and the more you can, get people to understand. Okay, I might not agree on this, that, or the other, but I understand the basics of what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
and so I can come to an informed opinion about this.
Mm-hmm. This isn't in my notes, but how do we deal with the decline of media literacy? For example, I've been obsessed a little bit lately with literacy rates in Quebec. Quebec's literacy rates are falling significantly. People below a 4th grade reading level is shockingly high. And it's a serious problem when it comes to hearing news, interpreting politics, interpreting things that people say. How do we deal with that as journalists? Do we need to write with a lower level? Do we need to write at the same reading level, or do we need to cater to a new audience? How do we deal with lowering media literacy?
So I think there's 2 issues here. One is literacy in general, people knowing how to read.
Yes, these are 2 separate issues, but I'm sort of combining them.
So that, I mean, is education. That's not something that that the media or higher academia can solve by itself. That's simply, grade school stuff. You need to provide better learning opportunities for children in particular, and adults who, aren't need that extra help to become literate. I think we have our part to play. It's used to be that in the newspaper there was a page every week for, kids in schools with puzzles and whatever to help them learn stuff.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about, people use terms like dumbing down or bringing down the reading level or whatever. I think there's an accessibility to news and information that needs to be improved. For example, people who cover politics for a living can reach a state where they start throwing out acronyms, assuming people know what they are because they deal with them on a daily basis. Sometimes you have to remember that someone coming across a story that you write, or a TV or radio package that you do, or whatever, a blog post that you write, might not have the background, might not know what's going on. So having to just explain, not simplifying it, not dumbing it down, but giving context, explaining how things work, explaining what things are. If you're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a lot of context that goes into that. If you're explaining climate change, there's a lot of context. And the more we can give people that background, get them up to speed, the better. I'm very much an advocate for, we need to be doing more educational journalism, in the sense of explaining how the world works, rather than focusing on what happened yesterday, which I find a lot of journalism has gotten into. Or, this politician said this politician said that. Go into the background. What is this issue? What are the stakes? What are the 2 sides? Giving everyone a fair shake, giving everyone's perspective, so that people can come to their own conclusions, rather than telling people how to think.
Yeah. Good point. I think we don't want to patronize the audience. That's a very bad idea. But giving more context is not patronizing. That is just giving more context. And I think in journalism, giving more context is always a good decision. So yeah. I hate the constant pessimism in journalism. I like to end things with solutions. So Steve, how can we journalists, me and you, Chris, Savannah, the people in our circles, the people at the Gazette, the people in CBC, how can we earn back the trust of the public?
First of all, be transparent. Um, you know, part of the problem with journalists expressing their opinions on things on social media, they'll argue that, oh, I should have the right to have opinions, and you do, but understand that if you have opinions, it's not the fact that you're publishing them on social media that is the problem. It's the fact that you have them in the first place. And so, if you are publishing opinions like that, understand that people are going to rightfully look at that and see the reporting you do through that lens. And so try to be as open-minded as possible. It is a tough thing to do, to accept the possibility that maybe what you think might be wrong, or that what you think might have exceptions or nuances. Um, there are very few things in the world that are, where one side is absolutely right and one side is absolutely wrong. So you need to accept that the world is a messy place and that things are more complicated than you might think. Be, more education, more background, more explaining things. People want to learn. A lot of traffic to news
Most people
websites
want to learn.
comes from Google, and that's because people are looking up stuff.
Right.
People are asking questions. People want to know stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can provide them answers, they will respect that, and not just answers that, focus on one side or focus on, one aspect. They want background. They want to learn as much as they can about a subject. And so the more you can provide to them, the better. And be creative. A lot of people, a lot of newsrooms, they decide what their daily news stories are going to be by going through a list of press releases and assigning reporters accordingly. We're seeing, to be optimistic in this sense, we're seeing a reduction in the number of people working for these mainstream outlets, but we're also seeing a very big increase in the number of news outlets. The Rover did not exist a few years ago.
No, it's 4 years
Ricochet
old
did
now.
not exist a few years ago. There are more media outlets out there with different and new funding models, ways um, of making ends meet that contribute to the diversity of the ecosystem. And I think in the future, we will see an ecosystem that is more diverse, not less. And that has me a bit optimistic. I'm still very concerned about the
Same.
the damage that will be caused while we awkwardly shuffle into whatever the new reality is going to be. But there are people out there, who are still doing journalism, trying to make a difference. And for the audience out there, I would say find people who do stuff that you think is valuable and support those people. Buy a subscription to a journalist who is covering stuff that you think needs to be covered. And if nobody is covering something that you think needs to be covered, maybe consider covering yourself. I started a blog almost 15 years ago because, it was just thoughts that I had in my head. But I started covering things kind of by accident that weren't being covered elsewhere. And that's how I grew an audience at first. And so rather than trying to blame news organizations for not, you know, uh, uh, covering stuff that you think needs to be covered, find someone who is covering it and support them. Or if that person doesn't exist, maybe that person can be you.
Good shit. Good shit, Steve. How can journalism, and you might not even agree with the way I'm phrasing this question, how can journalism go back to hard-hitting, really challenging questions that hold power accountable?
Hard hitting. A lot of people, when they think of hard hitting questions and accountability, particularly for like politicians, they think of argumentative stuff.
Right.
And often that's the kind of stuff that is going to make people distrust the media.
Right.
If you're getting into a back and forth argument with Pierre Poilievre saying everything he's saying is wrong, that's not doing your audience a service, because
Right.
you're not explaining to them why what he's saying is wrong. You're just arguing with the guy. if you look at the way a lawyer in the courtroom would ask questions to a witness, they're not arguing back and forth. They're asking questions and, making note of the answers. And so I would say that you can do hard-hitting journalism, you can do investigations without getting into a shouting match.
Right. I
And
mean, that's what I'm
those
trying to
things are
do
both
with us right now. I'm asking you questions. I let you talk,
exactly.
but I
And
tried to
like,
make
I
the
think you're
questions
probably
good.
getting more out of this
Yeah.
than if you were just started yelling at me
Right.
randomly.
I think you have valuable things to say, and the audience is definitely intelligent enough to conclude what they want from what you're saying. Trust the audience.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily right about everything I say.
No, totally.
You're not necessarily right about everything you
Totally.
say, but we're having this discussion.
Yeah.
And yeah, it kind of annoys me when I see journalists and people, people online thinking that, getting into a screaming match with someone is accountability journalism.
Right.
It's not.
Steve, is there any other thing you wanted to add before we go?
I think we've covered quite a bit.
We were pretty extensive, I think.
I think for the sake of general audiences, like, engage in good faith with journalists, and push news organizations to do the stuff that you want to see done in the world. And if you have those skills and that open mind and that curiosity, I think you should consider, maybe getting into it yourself. Yeah. and writing about the stuff that other people aren't writing about, and helping to educate the world, not necessarily through daily what happened yesterday journalism, but just if if you're worried about the population being, uneducated about something, try to help educate them.
Yeah. And that's so that. Steve had an incredibly calm cadence to his views, and I think a lot of what he said was supremely valuable. The challenges faced by journalism are growing, and it's hard to deny the fact that resources are thin for all of us. Thankfully, we have a wide berth of journalists working in many different places with a diverse set of opinions. Sadly, it is very challenging for journalists to make a living in 2024. Hopefully, we can remedy the industry soon. With that, thank you so much for listening to The Midnight Choir, and I encourage you to like, subscribe, go put this on your podcast application of choice, and go sign up for our newsletter, therover.ca/newsletter or therover.ca/support-us. Throw a little cash our way. Help us be an independent journalism where people can make a little bit of money. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.